Awesome. So, hi everyone once again. It's our third session of seminar discussions with Professor Sampath, and today we reached our third thinker in our kind of journey through Hegel and Heidegger, Jacques Derrida. I'm so excited to start the conversation about it today. And just a heads up, next Wednesday, we're going to have a much longer seminar discussion that will catch up on all the time that we, these days have to sacrifice to the schedules of others and like schedule of university. Next Wednesday, there are no classes, so I hope, some of our folks who were missing or not able to come during Wednesdays at 4 p.m. will be able to join us. And for now, I think the time for Wednesday would be from 1 p.m. till 5:30, meaning that there will be a break in between. There will be like time for like maybe a closer discussion. We'll think about what the format will be, but also if you wanna, feel free to bring lunch with you if you want, because I know it's like 1 a.m. or 1 p.m. is not the most convenient time to start, but at the same time, yeah, I'm very excited for a longer discussion that could like finalize certain things that we've been discussing this last couple of weeks. And yeah, for if you want to catch up or like revise certain things that we've discussed, there's also a YouTube channel that the videos that I've been posting on WhatsApp and campus groups. So, or, if you can find them, you can always send a message to me. And yeah, without further ado, please, again, Professor Sampath.
Thank you. I do this before me. Want to thank Matvey and the group and all of you for your commitment to this series, and it's always great to be back. I think we're going to dive right into the text. Let me offer some introductory remarks before we do our reading. I was a student of Derrida back in the early 90s. Ancient history, no Google, no internet. Email was just coming around to the university, so I sound like your parents and grandparents talk about the old days. But what that meant was that he, the teacher, would spend up to 4 hours in his public lecture per week. He'd offer a public lecture to an auditorium with, roughly 200 to 300 people, students, general audience, his translators, and then a small PhD seminar class for credit, for which you had to apply. And he would only take maybe, I don't remember, it was like a table like this, maybe 10 or 15 of us across different departments, where we would then do an actual course with him. And you'd write a final paper, and then of course, he being Mr. Dr. Professor Deconstruction would deconstruct the paper. So in some respects, very intimidating. Also back in my day, I know things vary now. I'll just speak for myself, you go right from undergrad to the PhD program. So we're not exactly old. I was roughly your age, maybe younger. I was 20 when I started the program. The youngest, looking back. And so that added to the level of intimidation facing a figure like him. Who is he? He's considered bedeviled, maybe notorious. So on the one hand, he's considered one of the most cited continental European philosophers of the post-World War II period. So one of the most influential. In the American context, we think of people like Noam Chomsky, who has original contributions in his fields, but for a lot of us, a beloved, now very old guy, but beloved social critic, theorist, like a pure thinker, someone who really innovated in his own field, but also extremely influential and influencing intellectual life. So Chomsky is, Foucault is in France, at the time where he died in 1984. So you think of these figures that cut across things. In the 20th century landscape, he may be more cited than even Jean-Paul Sartre, the great founder of existentialism, one of the most famous philosophers of the first half of the 20th century, like Heidegger. So a very influential figure, very important in his reception here in the Anglo-American context, Britain and the United States, at least from the 70s onwards. Was here in the 60s, I believe, visiting at Harvard of all places, but you know, the influence here in the Anglo-American context has been tremendous in humanities. Now, having said that, just like we talked about Heidegger and Hegel, it's one thing to talk about the name, or we were just talking about this earlier, maybe your generation especially find things on YouTube or the internet, and like try to dive in or get little primers. One thing to figure out, you know, when people talk about Derrida or deconstruction, the term itself has been in currency since you've been born. You know, it's been around. Everyone says we deconstruct this, but we don't really know, you know, what are we talking about? What does it mean? So there's one issue is, do we really know what we're talking about when we talk about deconstruction? The other part is, how many people have actually read Derrida? You know, I'm talking about scholars, and I'm talking about professors, and I'm talking about everybody, you know, it's just, because it's not easy. He's not easy, and his style and what he's trying to do, and we're going to try to make sense of that today, but a very introductory attempt to talk about what the critique is, what is he doing? What makes him innovative, if we think he's innovative? So that's that piece. The infamous piece is also in the Anglo-American world by the philosophy establishment, meaning the analytic tradition, the attempt to give Derrida an honorary doctorate by Cambridge University, I don't know when this was, received tremendous pushback. There was a campaign by Anglo-American philosophers to say, no way, not him. Heidegger, we got to the Heidegger issue at the end of the session last time about the notorious legacy of what he was, given his Nazi period. But you know, to criticize Derrida, the fear and the sort of hysteria that his work gave rise to, and why this kind of attempt to refute by the analytic establishment. In any case, the leading analytic figures led a campaign to deny him that degree. So who is this figure, and you know, why does he evoke such a strong response, either in favor or against? Well, born in 1930 in Algeria, of Sephardic Jewish ancestry, but if you all know your historical context, you've taken some classes. Vichy France, the Nazi-occupied France at the time, and then therefore the French colonies of Northern Africa. If you think about that, meant that he, you know, he lived during that colonial period of Algeria before decolonization, but also that Nazi-Vichy occupation. And so by the time he gets to France as a 19-year-old, you can imagine that he gets all of it all at once. Once they discover he's Jewish, you get the anti-Semitism. He's not of Ashkenazi European, Northern European descent. He's from the South. So it's really looking like me. So you get the racism, anti-Semitism, and then of course the conflation with MENA, meaning the Arabic population. So you can think about Fanon's work, the kind of Western ethnocentric racist take on, and the orientalization of the Arabic world. So he's coming out of this context. It's no wonder that you think about that type of complexity for his own identity. We've been talking about intersectionality, right? And the complexity of your identity. To come into the French establishment and with that level of both trauma and complexity of identity, and to begin a philosophical journey like you're all doing in your late teens and early 20s, to try to carve out a space for yourself, is the way I'd put it. You might think, oh, is this relativistic, or is it just, you know, about the individual perspective on things? No. I mean more phenomenologically, when you encounter anything. We talked about that already. A lot of what's in question is suspending yourself in the process, not beginning with a vantage point. Intersectionality today, when we use the term, it could easily mean not just the entwinement of minoritized variables of what makes you an incredibly complex person. Let's say you're minoritized in multiple ways, a queer person of color with a disability and an immigrant status of uncertainty, facing the trauma. It's multiple vectors of oppression hitting you at the same time, prismatically, in which you can't use a single frame of reference to then describe the nature of that oppression. It could be that. or it can mean that the complexity is so deep that it hollows out the center and you don't have a vantage point to begin with at all. Just depends upon how complex things are. So, what's called living in the margins, so to speak, because every dominant frame of reference can't capture that level of marginality, that level of alienation, that level of singularity. So in many respects, he comes out of this, his own identity lends itself in many ways to what the project of deconstruction is going to be all about. So I'm going to turn to the text now and begin a very slow reading. I think Matvey might have introduced what we're reading. The preface, by the way, by Gayatri Spivak, one of the main protagonists for post-colonial theory, and his student of comparative literature in French, that undertake at her young age, at the time, a translation of the work, which she is also famous for, if you've seen the translator's preface, is a work in its own right, and there's been a tremendous sort of acknowledgement of this, what people thought at the time, ingenious attempt to summarize in 50-page, however long it is, translator's preface, the entire history of continental philosophy leading up to Derrida's work. Yes, Manny.
Quick question. You mentioned you were a student at Derrida, but when he teach, does he speak French or English?
In the United States, he'd come to, at that time, NYU. He started at Yale for a while, he was at Hopkins, but at least he would lecture there. But in teaching NYU, but in the US, University of California system where I grew up, from undergrad all the way to PhD postdoc lecturer. He would speak in English, and it was tremendous. I mean, his level of English. But in front of you, for example, in the public lectures and or the seminars, you'd have the German of Being in Time plus English, his own French, of course, texts of any kind, maybe some Greek texts for ancient philosophy. So he's moving around, but the lectures would be in English, and the presentations would be in English. And it was remarkable because then you can turn around and do that in German and of course French, but not Hebrew. We might get to that at the end of our discussion today, like what he was doing at the very end before he died, and his only trip to Israel. Maybe it has to do with that Vichy France horizon, because the banning of the lycees, the banning of the teaching of Hebrew by the Nazis. So he going underground, taking solace or refuge with the Islamic majority. But he has his own problematics and kind of highly alienated, if you will, relationship to his own Sephardic origins, which he talks about at the end, in some of his very last writings. So the translator's preface, to come back to Spivak, is a good summary of all the genealogical intellectual roots that made the work possible, but Derrida's early start in the 60s. I don't want to summarize this, and I don't want to throw out big phrases. Some of you are very invested in these fields, but like phenomenology, structuralism, existentialism, Saussurian linguistics, Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis, iconoclastic figures that don't fit any school of thought, like the Collège de Sociologie, Bataille, Hegelianism, or as Vincent Descombe once said, the 3 H's of France. On the one hand, Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger, whereas Deleuze says the quote unquote not so holy trinity of Freud and Nietzsche. And it depends on, all of you have read all these figures in one way or another, and some are more important for you than others. But all this is sort of descending on a very complex landscape. Structuralist Marxism under Althusser in the 60s, we shouldn't forget that. Very important figure for Derrida, who he worked for as a tutor, as a grader of exams, for the term in French, but under Althusser. So many influences, and even the early Foucault, who was there early, and got an earlier start than Derrida, both in terms of his work, he was older than Derrida, and his fame, to which Derrida responded in a very virulent critique of Foucault. So I recommend reading the preface when you get a chance, so at least you can see what's he drawing from. We're going to try to tease out some of those major concepts or schools of thought in the excerpt alone. Let's find it, 417. see how long this preface is. Speed things up here. There's preface, but maybe half the length of the book itself.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. 80 pages.
It could be. It's in the Roman letters, so I can skip to that.
Almost there.
Was there
Huh.
preface? Now, this is Derrida's preface, which is very brief. He has his own preface. And I might come back to it, but I really want to start with the excerpt. Well, what is an excerpt? If you put that definition into, he obviously very playful, creative thinker, obsessed with writing, inscription, and textuality, and the encountering of texts. And really, as he says, a whole new way of thinking about reading, which we'll get into. But it's the Middle Ages, or antiquity, the kings, typically the face of an emperor. The GOP wants to pass a bill to put Trump on this $200 bill. It's an imperial stamp. It's the structure of power, inscription, text, and writing. And then the line that gives you some information maybe about the date of the structure and or the author. It could be not part of the general image of the coin. Pretending to show you something that doesn't exist, part of the Derridian movement. But you can imagine a coin there. The exergue is that what's that inscription beneath that may or may not exist with the actual image, or maybe it's on the back of the coin, so you can't really see it unless you flip it over. So you see an image of some coin that's supposed to symbolize the structure of power. It's sort of like the authorial origin of the thing, or quite frankly, the meaning of the thing. This is the very thing that he's going to question. At the end of this excerpt, he's going to say there is no excerpt. So what is this? What are we reading? Let's read some of these opening quotes that starts the entire work. The one who will shine in the science of writing will shine like the sun. Scribe. O Samas, by your light, you scan the totality of land as if they were cuneiform symbols. So that's from antiquity. And Rousseau, he's going to spend a lot of time analyzing of grammatology. These three ways of writing correspond almost exactly to three different stages according to which one can consider men gathered into a nation. The depicting of objects is appropriate to a savage people, signs of words and of propositions to a barbaric people, and the alphabet to civilized people. And so, on the essay on the origin of languages, which is the text he's going to focus on. And then our guy from the very beginning, Hegel's encyclopedia, alphabetic script isn't itself and for itself the most intelligent. So already there you have some phases of maybe ancient cave inscriptions, the early Homo sapien, depicting mere animal objects in red. Rosemary.
It's like the Norm Macdonald bit, like, I just checked the history books and what luck, the good guys won every time. It's like, oh, what luck, alphabetic script is the most historically progressive and intelligent means of
Text of
expression.
history to the victor.
Yeah.
How would you know about a Norm Macdonald? That guy's not, I think he's dead. He's like a comedian from a long time ago. You got it, again, you got it from YouTube. You got the text of Norm Macdonald, not the actual Norm Macdonald, but in any case, yeah, what coincidence. But
We're so lucky, we got alphabetic script.
the depiction of objects, you know, the early Homo sapien that actually paints the images of the animals in the cave. So is that a one-to-one correspondence of lived experience? Is it an inscription in terms of shapes? Does it represent objects? To maybe some kind of early pre-alphabetic kind of mixture of both the representational object and the inscription as word or proposition that still may have died out. Languages do die out. But then what at that point, what are we talking about if we're not talking about the direct representation of the object? And then finally, what most languages are built on, if they're written forms now, is this structure of alphabet and then a logical structure of grammar and the rules and relationships within that, which is interminable, because once you have the alphabet, you can then virtually produce anything, because you can create new words to give new meaning, and perhaps there are new objects that appear that you give new meaning to, or the words become an object unto themselves. But Sasserian linguistics, which is one of the main roots of the early 20th century from French thinkers, you know that, and he'll get to this later, of course, in the work in chapter 1. If you think of signifier is the word written or oral, and signified as the mental image or the object, and maybe there's a correspondence between them. And the relationship between that signifier and signified composes a sign, but for someone like a Saussure, in terms of founding modern linguistics and its ambiguity and complexity, is that the differentiation of signs is quite arbitrary, meaning the relationship that allows us to take the word written or oral and make it correspond to an object. Cat, with the funny cat. I can experiment with some Mandarin. Gao is the word, or gato in Spanish. I know some Spanish. So, you know, there are variations in the signifier, but it's supposed to refer to the same mental object. The problem is that the relationship between the two in the unity of the sign is fundamentally ambiguous and contingent, and so is the differentiation between them. So it's a closed system and it's open at the same time. My point is that already here you have levels of distinctions being made that don't speak to, unless you want to subscribe to the idea of a myth, a mythological idea of an origin, because we're all kind of thrown into this. Now, maybe we all think we're here, right? Work with a certain language, alphabetic structure to then both read and write and speak. But he's going to upend all this very quickly. Let's keep reading here. The triple exergue is intended not only to focus attention, here we go, why we forgot this. This work is from 1967. Critical race theory, intersectionality, a lot of us that do that work today comes much later. And quite frankly, which is what I find amazing, if you go back to some of those original critical race theorists, thinkers in the late 80s, they're referencing and quoting Derrida's deconstruction of binary logic. Think about that. What is that connection between something? Look at this. This is it. Can I get more explicit? I want to ask you what you think that word means. And by that, ethnocentrism, he's talking about Europe, white Western Europe. Let's clarify. Gentile white Western Europe. The Rousseau and the Hegel, what are these guys saying about their trajectory? Civilized and the most intelligent. Eurocentrism, which everywhere and always has controlled the concept of writing, or merely to focus on attention, what I call logocentrism. Logos in the Greek of both word, reason, the unity of that, perhaps in the Gentile Christian institutionalized structure of the West, the logos becoming flesh, embodied presence, word truth, language is present. The metaphysics making present, but also transcending senses and nature, getting to the essence, right, of the phonetic writing. Now, phonetic is just to hear, right? So when you say phonetic, it typically, what we would like to dream of, ideally, is when you utter a sound, when you have an alphabet, you speak a language, you have an alphabet, you get a nice correspondence between the sound and how you spell something. That would be phonetic. But that doesn't even really happen. In English, past tense was. I was at the store yesterday. Was sounds like W-U-Z. Was, you, was, not W-A-S. We spell was as in the past tense, W-A-S. When I say it, it sounds like a you. One of his key ideas, in other words, in terms of speaking, you might get the same sound, but when it comes to writing, you get something entirely different, or vice versa. Différence, which will become one of his key terms with an A, sounds like différence with the E. So in speaking, it sounds exactly the same, but in writing, they're two totally different things, and you get two totally different types of words. And when we get to différence, it means to delay and postpone. defer as in like postpone something. I'm gonna defer it to a later date. There's a delay in temporality issue, but also means the act of differentiation. Now we're gonna have to get into that because the event of differentiating is itself not something located as an original presence. The difference is already there, but the act of cutting, driving, dividing itself is not based on any kind of presence. If you're on the other side of the difference, which is where we mostly are because of all these binary structures, this or that, white or black, cisgender man or cisgender woman, but the origin of that event of difference itself is what's withdrawn. It's sort of already inscribed in this logocentric hierarchy, which has this Eurocentric basis. So there's a lot already happening here with regard to this first paragraph. There's much to, we haven't even started with these notions of phonetic writing. The metaphysics of phonetic writing, which was fundamentally phonematic and essential reasons, are inaccessible to a simple historical relativism, nothing but the most original and powerful ethnocentrism in the process of imposing itself upon the world, controlling one and the same order. Wow, what is he talking about? I mean, historically, we can talk about colonization and enslavement and the decimation of indigenous peoples. But this greater antiquity, this ethnocentrism, this logocentric structure of the West, it's going to come back to the West, has this imperial quality. That means a dimension of power and control. Your guy, Marx, has a lot to say about that. Yes, Gustav.
I have kind of a basic question, which is not totally related to what you're saying right now, but if deconstruction is the act of going to the very root of what any sort of work or thing is, then why do today we use the word deconstruction to mean to be against the norm of whatever society we're talking about? Let's say, like, let's go with heteronormative white American society. Being deconstructed, it means kind of being opposed to that. Well, at least from my view.
Why do
How
we
is-
use it in that sense?
Yeah.
This is the question I think you should hold,
Okay.
because this is what the attempt to introduce, because he's going to get into that. Yeah, what is the meaning of it today versus what is it actually, what is it? Is it to de-sediment? Is it to go inside the construction, see some kind of thing that was erased from the beginning, and then maybe put it back together? Maybe it has something more to do with construction than opposition.
Mhm.
It has so many different meanings today because it's just used, and I think it's used in a way where it can almost mean anything for anyone, depending upon how it gets politicized. But we want to get to the philosophical innovation here. So we're going to try to get to that sense of what it actually means. Rosemary.
Well, provisional answer would be that the very act of sort of examining something, calling it into question, de-sedimenting it, as you say, sort of, looking for traces, whatever, like, sort of as an act, like, calls the thing into question in some sense. And so it doesn't necessitate opposition, but it grounds the means by which, like, that opposition can take place. Like, by taking something that's assumed to sort of be like natural or monolithic or fixed, and to sort of make it float, like, suddenly you can do things with it. So I would say that's part of where the connection comes.
We'll get to the definitions of it in our discussion. What I want you to keep in mind right now is, let's just use his words. There's an ethnocentrism, there's a logocentrism, there's this trajectory from barbarity or primitive to the advanced and the civilized. It all seems to be Western and Eurocentric. There's a priority of the phonetic. There's that illusion of the sign, unifying the signifier and the signified. But there's this hierarchy. That's the problem. Not just undoing something and redoing it, or going inside and playing around and doing whatever you want. There is not, I wouldn't maybe it's too quick to talk about opposition. We're gonna talk about deconstruction and dialectic too, and dialectical thinking. What's the relationship between them today? And then also at E, we will say the passage of all post-Hegelian attempts. So we're not even past Hegel. He says Hegel's the end of the book and the first big thinker of writing. Hegel is actually more key perhaps than everyone thinks. Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Freud, and figures are important for Derrida, which they are, as a social phenomenology and all those other schools of thought. But Hegel meaning this, when we talk about post-Hegelian, what the hell does that actually mean? Because you can get caught up in Hegel and he's already, in fact, deconstructing within. There's no simple three-moment dialectic as we spoke about last time. Or a synthesis. What is that? You can say, yeah, the notion of the system or the absolute revelation of truth, et cetera, et cetera. It's far more complex. Something else is going on. It has to do with history. The historicity. But let's keep this in mind. The ethnocentrism, the logocentrism, and what we're going to talk about is the destruction of hierarchies. So what are these hierarchies? As we're going to get a little more dense as we go along, concept of writing in a world where phoneticization of writing was to simulate its own history that it's produced. So writing is representation. Writing, you're Norm Macdonald, but writing is history. All these things, if you're going to think there's a signified behind all this, oh, writing is just this text, physical material, see it. Or history is just whoever, whether it's the victors or if it's Trump or if it's whoever, the history books that are forced on us, opposed to other people's history, or subaltern histories, or alternative histories or counter histories. You know, the histories that are never told, the history here of the United States. Doesn't tell it from a people standpoint, doesn't tell Black history or Indigenous history. It tells the history of the founding quote unquote fathers. So the problem with deconstruction, just like with Heidegger's ontological difference, you can't start with presence. And there's a time problem here too. You can't even just assume past is no longer, future is yet to be, and here we are in the present, like right now, self-same present. I'm speaking, it's simultaneous, we can hear each other, I can hear me, you can hear me, and there's maybe some meaning that's arising from it. You think that's happening, and that writing itself is somehow subsidiary. What does he say here? This metaphysics of things being present, this text being present, or Raj speaking in speech and us being simultaneous right now, 435. That's all metaphysics. I'm going to link this up to, I'm going to take him seriously here. Ethnocentrism, Greek Western metaphysics, the Hegel that everybody wants to attack in the philosophy of history. No history begins with the Greeks, everybody else is prehistory, including the Jews. Babylonians, Egyptians, Sumerians, Persians, Chinese, Indians, Africans. In this philosophy of history, it really begins with the Greeks, Romans, West, and of course culminates with him in German idealism and beyond. So here, this is something going on. He's going to lump all these guys in there together. These are, of course, all Western Gentile figures. I don't see Spinoza. In spite of all the differences, not only from Plato to Hegel, including Leibniz, but beyond these apparent limits from the pre-Socratics, Greek to Heidegger, always assign the origin of truth in general to the logos, the history of truth, the truth of truth. This order here is either primary or secondary. If that's the primary or secondary figure, it's not just a duplication. This one is truth, origin, history, physics, Eurocentric, logocentric, phoneticization, writing. This thing here, which will be erased, being is not being's ontological difference in Heidegger. Let's worry about this one. I wish it looks like a doubling, so maybe it has to be called something else. But what is this predicated? Except for metaphysical diversion, that we have to explain the debasement of writing and its repression outside of full speech. Somehow this original hierarchy was created. Writing is impure, writing is dead, writing is dirty, writing is demonic. Just like blackness and brownness is, when you think about white supremacy, Gentile white supremacy. What's real, embodied, and full, like outside the veil in Du Bois, is lived speech. this dead copy is unfortunate. I'd rather talk to the person right in front of me. I wish Derrida was right there. Why do I have to go read his work? And this is secondary. This is a dead copy of the lived speech. This goes, according to him, goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. This is essential. This is appearance. This is the form of the noesis. The idea, if he's going to have a version of Hegel, the absolute idea, the concept of science and logic, what he's getting at. So the metaphysics of presence, the three things of time, you can't have presence if you don't have past and future. You can have the presence of those two. And then the dialectical contortions and the negations that we talked about. I'm me because I'm not Rosemary, and the negation is built into me. And for me to assert that I have to, the difference also comes with me and haunts me. So I got to overcome that and have some synthesis or unified structure to that dialectical resolution. Looks like three moments: identity, antithesis, synthesis. Anything of three for someone like Derrida falls under this. And that's predicated on this debasement. Now, is deconstruction the undebasing, uplifting, valuation? Not quite. Oppressed becoming oppressed. It's not like it just suddenly, you just flip it. Let's keep reading here for a second, and I'll definitely get back to your perspectives, Gustavo, or question, and Rosemary, your response. Concept of science and scientificity of science, which has always been determined as logic. Who likes logic? Jabs against the analytic tradition, but people can get very obsessed with this and spend all their time thinking of reduced philosophy all to that. A concept that has always been a philosophical concept, even if the practice of science is constantly challenged, its imperialism of the logos. By invoking, for example, from the beginning and ever increasingly non-phonetic writing. So non-phonetic would be that distortion between speech and a writing that doesn't, when you spell it out, it doesn't spell out the sound of the speech. So was. Was not W-A-S. That's how we spell was, as the past tense I was in the store, to what it actually sounds like, W-Z. No doubt the subversion has always been contained within the system of direct address, subject to subject, self to self, identity. Here we are face to face, self and the other, the ethics of the other. Levinas, of course, is a very important figure, which we'll get to, hopefully, if we have time. It's an influential moment for Derrida, especially his notion of the trace. But all of this gives birth to the project of science. It could not have been otherwise. Nonetheless, it's a peculiarity of our epoch. What is epoch? It's not just the modern age and the Middle Ages or antiquity. Is he talking about writing its history and the entire expanse and who gets to write it and how long is it? Is it just BC and CE, 0 in the middle, Jesus in the middle, and we divide up our time? Is it 5,000 years before 0, and here we are 2025 since 0? The age of the universe. What is this epoch? The historical origin and structural possibility of philosophy as of science, the condition of the episteme begins to lay hold on world culture, science, and advancements can no longer be satisfied that something is happening. Is it something happening in his time, maybe in the 60s? Yeah, all kinds of stuff happened in the 60s. It's ancient history for all of us. None of us were around. But some kind of dislocation, the inadequation of all this thinking. What he's trying to get at here is that something is being shaken. But that doesn't mean we're just free. You see what he's getting at. It's already begun to make its presence felt. But today, something lets it appear as such, allows it to kind of take over without our being able to translate this novelty into clear-cut notions of mutation. There's no real discontinuity revolution from this structure. Where in a way, we're all kind of trapped within it. These values belong, no doubt, to the system whose dislocations today presented as such. They describe the styles of historical movement, which was meaningful, like the concept of history only within the logos of Keith. So if everything he just said here is true, it's not about just destroying it or opposing it and saying, hey, let's just get rid of it. Which makes terms like decoloniality and postcolonial very difficult to understand. If you do a course on post-colonial theory, which I just finished, it's not just the legacy of colonization, it's the persistence of it. Is it neo-colonization, neo-imperialism? Well, look what's happening in the world. Trump's upending the order, oligarchic capitalism, monarchical capitalism. So we have to wonder here about, you want to question presence, but that doesn't mean you're somewhere else. Here we are still as a trace of, whose origin has been erased, and yet there's a remainder, and it's not exactly past, and yet we're feeling like all of you are feeling a bit dislocated. You don't want some simple identity put on you, right? You don't want your values formed by you, by the older generation. Some uneasiness here. So what's going on? By alluding to a science of writing reined in by metaphor, metaphysics, and theology, this exergue must not only announce that the science of writing grammatology shows signs of liberation, I think all of us are concerned about our signs of liberation as a result of decisive effort. So now grammatology is introduced as the so-called science, but it's going to be based on that recognition that writing has been considered inferior to that logocentric, Eurocentric presence. We're going to come back to time, and Heidegger, of course, is important because he's arguably the first to question it. My argument against Heidegger, and quite frankly, my teacher, is that don't reduce Hegel. Don't just make Hegel of three. Go take a look at that guy's the spirit-time connection, which, as we saw last time, how being in time classes and concludes. He's reading Hegel at the very end there, and then the whole thing ends. And people like Derrida and all the generations since are trying to respond to that moment. We're racing ahead here. But these efforts are necessarily discrete, dispersed, almost imperceptible. That is the quality of their meaning and of the milieu within which they produce their operation. I'd like to suggest above all that however becoming this necessary, the undertaking might be, and even if given the most favorable hypotheses, it did overcome all technical and epistemological obstacles, as well as all the theological and metaphysical impediments that have limited it hitherto. Such a science of writing must run the risk of never being established as such and its name. So you're going to say, oh, he's already copping out. It's like I sometimes say about the failure of Heidegger's fundamental ontology. He took apart the problem of metaphysics in the West. He didn't just say what is being and try to answer it. It's Plato's forms, it's Leibniz's monad, it's Hegel's spirit, just to be superficial. Spinoza's pantheism, Kant's transcendental categories and forms. He asked about the meaning, the question of the meaning of being, and the meaning of the question. And he had to come up with a character who is committed to posing that question, but not answering it, because you have to get to the very ground of that being, who allows something or gifts it the ability to even pose the question. Does, I think, is the main character in Breathing Time. But the work ends in obscurity. Time is a horizon for understanding being, but it's not the linear time. It's not the superficiality of what we think is our birth. You guys were born 20 years ago, still in 2000. So it's not that biological birth. And therefore death is not just perishing physical minds, something else. Time is a horizon for understanding being. But being is never present. That's how. Here comes Derrida saying, I'm going to make a move against that. Okay, what's that move? What's he doing? Theology. Theologos, the word, truth, revelation, representation, concept of God. If you think that's what one definition of theology is, what's the absolute? Or the will to conceptualize and represent it, which is metaphysics, beyond any simple appearance or anything that's pre-given. It almost has to articulate itself. It has to give itself, as Aristotle says at the end of metaphysics. And he names it too. But it's this Greek logo concept of the absolute as being, but also the truth of it, the being of truth, the truth of being. All this sort of gets conflated in this origin called the West, that metaphysical pursuit of the truth of being, and also putting into question, thanks to Heidegger, the being of truth. It's not just proposition or correspondence, or the subject-object relationship like we talked about. Something is announcing itself, totally other. Many of you descend from the West. My ancestors don't. From India. But you can ask yourself, wow, did the West set in motion this destining, to use some Heideggerian language, to, begin with that great ingenious beginning, only to end up with a guy like Nietzsche who questions everything, goes insane in the process, passing through Hegel. And then we get to Heidegger, who's supposed to be the bridge to some other that we haven't even considered. Do we reestablish mystery to that Western nihilism? Well, we're not going to do theology and metaphysics. These are impediments. We're not going to create a science of writing. We're going to take seriously the nature of critique and what it means, what is it earlier, the signs of liberation. It goes up here. I want to know from you, like you're going to get to your theory of liberation and praxis, which the group's about. We're all worried, especially you. You're the ones that have to live a long time, if we're going to live that. Things are really bad. Frighteningly bad. Like tragicomically bad. It's getting so bad, like it's almost like every day gets worse and they're absurd. You know what I'm talking about. Something's happening, something's accelerating. So what's he saying is this, what's his kind of idea here? Okay, or never, so this project that he's talking about can't define the unity of its project or its object. So it's not simple opposition. I'm not just going to go around critiquing things I hate or opposed to. But my view is deconstruction oftentimes is the undoing of both sides of the opposition. I hate to say it, but it would be like pitting CNN and Fox News together. They seem oppositional. They're both going at each other, as you know. One supports Trump and MAGA, or apparently does, and the other one wants to be more critical. And then some of us want the third perspective, but try to go underneath the opposition and say, hey, what's going on here? What are both assuming on both ends that are then occluding some other degree of oppression or repression that both can't admit to? Remember that repression of writing, speech, that's broadly speaking. But why wouldn't you want a unity of the project or the object? Do you have a unity to yourself and your self-consciousness? Remember, we did that with Hegel. Or the who question. We had 5 entities involved in that with Heidegger. And he didn't answer the question of the who. Who is your who? You want to fill up your who with something? The I? Remember we talked about that. I don't like my who. And I don't want to name my who. Now, in many respects, liberation is the ability not to be named or have your eyes straitjacketed, certainly by the other, but by yourself or by the tradition. No better time to be radical critics than you, the young. That's when do it now, because trust me, as you get older, you lose the fire. So, and in many respects, he's talking about that generation, the 60s. He was young. Or not being able to either write discourse on method or to describe the limits of each field. So, let's just not even call it traditional social science. Definitely not social science. But whatever other disciplines that feed the foundations of the humanities so it can justify it. So I got to teach the social scientists and the scientists that I have a method and that's why I'm legitimate and that you guys can't take us over. Maybe he's questioning this kind of false consciousness inside the humanities itself. Like, why does it have to legitimate itself? Well, what's going on? For essential reason, the unity of all that allows itself to be attempted to do through the most diverse concepts of science and writing is in principle more or less covertly yet always determined by an historical metaphysical epoch of which we merely glimpse the closure. I do not say the end. Closure meaning, okay, if we are trapped in all that metaphysics of presence, the speech writing hierarchy, that progression of the barbaric to the alphabetic and civilized, we're all in a way kind of trapped in the West if we're trapped in this continental philosophical tradition. You're not going to go find a space alien and ask them about their philosophy. That hasn't appeared. I think for our conversation, we want to know, well, what does this mean for the global South and the East today? And quite frankly, when I talk to, well, our friends, if continental philosophy is going to die in the West, guess what? It's very much alive in Latin America, Asia, India, lots in the Middle East, throughout the world, there's Eastern Europe. So Western continental philosophy outside the West, thank goodness. So it doesn't end. This questioning, this incessant questioning and critique, but it messianically maybe points or signifies the possibility of something wholly other that has escaped the West. That idea of science and of writing, therefore also science writing is meaningful for us only in terms of an origin, and within a world in which a certain concept of the sign, a certain concept of relation between speech and writing have already been assigned. We've been assigned this relationship in speech and writing. We want to unsettle it. We want to move in a different way. Which is what he's saying. A most determined relationship in spite of its privilege, its necessity, in the field of vision that it is controlled for a few millennia. So a few millennia would be 2,000 years since, almost 2,000 years since zero. So maybe it means 1,000 years prior to zero, which would be, truth be told, the Mosaic period, so biblical period. Definitely, therefore, Egyptian, Persian, Babylonian, Greco-Roman, so but now it's producing its own dislocation for creating itself. I'll end here. Perhaps patient meditation and painstaking investigation. I like those as a couple of definitions, which lends itself into some Eastern forms of thinking. Talk to Eastern scholars about the reception of deconstruction. There you go. Which is still provisionally called writing, far from falling short of the science of writing, or of hastily dismissing it by some obscurantist reaction, letting it rather develop its positivity as far as possible, are the wanderings of a way of thinking, that's an interesting word, that is faithful and attentive to the ineluctable world of the future, which proclaims itself at present beyond the closure of knowledge. That's a weird statement. A lot going on with time. He just mentioned closure, but not end. And these, you might be inclined to try to spatialize this, like, oh, we're trapped in the West. We're trapped in a bubble. Or maybe it's transparent, so I can kind of see outside of it. I mean, I'm inside here. I'm not outside, but I can kind of see. Is that what I'm talking about? Seeing that person walk down there. So, what is this beyond? What's the faithful and the attentive beyond this hierarchy, the binary logic, the Eurocentrism, Western metaphysics, the will to truth being a truth. Heidegger, you too, you're being and beings, you want to get at being, you think there's some universal meaning to it. You couldn't do it, you couldn't come up with what it is beyond Western metaphysics. And then the younger me, looking at all these guys, thinking, well, why are they so obsessed with three? Derrida, we had time, and we had a whole year or seminar on him, kind of influenced me to start thinking about this stuff a long time ago, which is, what did he mean by, remember, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the fourth moment, fourth side. It doesn't appear in those three moments. Where is that? Fourness. Nobody wants to talk about four because that's not very Western. Everything has to be the traditional Hegel, the simple Hegel is three, time is three, Christian Trinity. But four-dimensional, fourth side. Okay, the future can only be anticipated. Now, here we go. Here's the problem. What is the disruptor? What is the dislocator? What is who are you? Who's Derrida? What's the future? The future can only be anticipated in the form of an absolute danger. There's some bravado here that he's announcing. It is that which breaks absolutely with constituted normality and can only be presented as a sort of monstrosity. If you put this, if we were intellectual historians, we put this back in this context. By the 60s, this is 1967, so from 61, the book on Husserl's Origin of Geometry, to all these essays you wrote that would be compiled in something called Writing Indifference, this comes out. and wrote a book, big book, Speech and Found, and also on Husserl. And then major works by the late 60s to early 70s, Dissemination, Origins of Philosophy. He's basically written essays almost attacking everyone that existed at the time and showing how they can't see what they can't see in their own thinking and undermining the logical consistency of their thought. Those of you that like the analytic stuff, I kind of like the analytic stuff too. Kurt Gödel too. He proved the incompleteness of all proofs with his ingenious way of getting into mathematical sets and showing why they're unstable. Logicians don't want that. You don't want to show the instability of mathematical truths. Gödel, the genius, that's what he did. He logically proved the incompleteness of all proofs. Well, Derrida, in a way, takes apart structuralism, phenomenology, all these other big thinkers, structuralist Marxism. That really is the dawning of deconstruction. Now, taking apart, maybe is that the right word? It's not opposing. It's not imbuing positively value in the state. That's what makes deconstruction for a lot of folks obscurantist, because it's not forthcoming with, let's say, it's an ethical stance or a political stance, which some of us care about, right? Or how can I summon this as a way to start a movement? My response to that, don't accuse Derrida of deconstruction, because I just said he was referenced in critical race theory. It obviously influenced the birth of that level of critique. A lot of you are interested in 20th century critical theory, which was a reaction by the German Jewish great thinkers of the period in response to the authoritarian fascism, with Nazism of that time, and capitalism, or leveraging Marx, Freud, Weber, Nietzsche, maybe some Heidegger too, in the attack of their historical present, the superficiality of Western industrial life and culture. We go back to Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectical enlightenment. But similarly, you can say deconstruction is a critique of the postmodern present. All the things that would lead to postmodernism, he's already kind of way back then at the time in which it's just all launching, exposing it. And so maybe it's a monstrosity. For the future world and for that within it, which we will have to put into question, the values of science and environment. For that which guides our future anterior, there is yet no answer. So what are we trying to get at here? Let me just sort of like try to summarize. Summarize, that's impossible. But so the 70s has a series of important works, one on painting, a big double text on Hegel called Law, continuous kind of revisitings of Lacan and Freud. 80s takes him in a different direction with other works. By the early 90s, he dies in 2004. Very important works. That was the period in which I was formed, on Marx, Specters of Marx. The book, everyone was waiting, like, what do you write on Heidegger and death? Because it's so crucial for you as a figure. What's your difference versus his ontological difference? He's the main guy that everyone's trying to respond to. So he finally produces his work on Heidegger and death in the early 90s. There's a work, Donné Lemore, A Gift of Death. Small little text. You know what's interesting? He's analyzing Patočka, the Czech philosopher of the post-Cold War period. Early 90s is just a few years away from the end of 1989. Mm-hmm. And I believe he quotes, I don't pronounce his name right. I know the last name, Havel, Czech poet liberator.
Yeah. Yeah. Pavel? Is it Václav Havel?
Yeah. So what's he doing? What's Derrida, the French guy, Maine of descent, in Irvine, California, Newport Beach, talking about Eastern European right after the Cold War. But why is he talking about these figures? Well, one very interesting aporia or paradox. An aporia meaning impasse, not just a structurally, logically difficult paradox. Credo's paradox. I'm telling a lie. Well, if that statement is true, then it negates the proposition and I can't utter it. If it's false, I'm inverting the meaning of it and actually telling the truth. That's the fun that you can play with when it comes to paradoxes and ancient Greek. He's not talking about that. He's talking about this if you want to bring an end, let's stay here, end to history. Eschatology and theology. Eschaton. Maybe the Abrahamic faiths, which are colliding obviously today, as we know. By that I mean the monotheistic faith. So I want to just bracket for a second the Eastern traditions. Confucianism, non-Confucianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. Certainly indigenous traditions throughout the world, very much loved. The Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. But the eschaton, not just the end time or the last days, but the teleological culmination of something. It's beginning and it culminates in something. Perhaps the erasure of that linear time and its transcendence into a new structure or a new creation beyond linear time. Certainly the idea of origin and end. If you cross out those ideas, like origin and end, well, then you're going to cross out things like a cisgender assigned at birth. You're going to cross out superficial understandings of death as just physical demise. But linear time itself is being called. If you bring in an end to something like history, in a way, you're drawing from that metaphysics of presence to spatialize it. And you're killing off the possibility, even in this notion of an end to history. You're bringing in, as he said, the verdict of non-history. It's silly to talk about that, not because history keeps going on. Fukuyama, end of history, 1989. We won. The West, democracy, capitalism, markets, individual rights, property. Witness. What's happening today? Bring in the end and say, okay, everybody else, you're just going to have to catch up to this. Try something else, you're going to fail. Nothing else works. Look at the best. Just, just call it a day. Everybody else just catch up to this state. In a way, he's kind of reacting to this as well. This notion of the end is, in fact, and you think it makes history finite, but he calls that non-histories. Superficially, you could say, well, is he advocating for an endless progression? No, he doesn't want that either, because that's back to linear time. So the aporia, what are you going to do if you don't have an end and you don't have endlessness? That's what Kant would call a cosmological antinomy. Similarly, if you don't have a simple origin to something, you have a genealogical dispersion. The West has to tell itself it has marriage, Greco-Roman. Perhaps it's monotheistic. I don't want to say Judeo-Christian, but certainly Roman Christian, institutional Christian, by the 3rd century. Greco-Roman, Gentile Christian, whatever. The whiteness has the origin. That story of the origin. Well, there's something other to that that doesn't rise to the level of full presence or speech. There perhaps is a trace of it that's linking that trace of that most archaic, as he says, to what's beyond the closure, which is way out there in the future. But it never just, and he says maybe it proclaims itself in the present, but it can't be made present. So that's the important. You're not just going to prioritize writing over speech now and denigrate speech. What is other to our historical present? Foucault came up with all these great critiques of the West too. Prisons, sexuality, governmentality, the biopower, mental institution badness, medicine, the body. Thank you, Foucault. Yeah, those are powerful critiques. You're right. Something's really bad about our historical present based on how we got here. This carceral institutionalized way of living and thinking. Let's be free of it. Thank you, Foucault. But Foucault, you're also trapped in the structure too. That's not the monstrosity. I think I want us to try to move into this space of what does this mean to you? This last sentence here. A positivity, non-reasonable way of thinking, faithful and attentive to the ultimate will of the future. You, that's you. It's also. This is stifling. This sounds like a radical revolutionary for me. I'll read it as revolutionary. In a way, an appeal to justice, but not oppositional. But let's just not lose sight of this. And I'll stop here. What I said earlier. Stay here. Triple Exergue. Ethnocentric, logocentric, phonetic, speech is presence, subject is unified. All the metaphysicians having some kind of will to truth to think they can answer the question of being. And he's going to throw all that into question. Matt, I'll stop here and let's have Matt maybe.
I'll try to begin and, I'll try to not take too much time, but some questions that I had while reading it that led me to thinking right now while, we were talking about all this, like really seem to be really kind of interconnecting everything that we've been speaking about. And I want to like also pose it as a question in the end. So I'll start, I'll say about this part is that definitely that approach that he tries to kind of give, for me at least, it really seemed very similar to, things that you've mentioned initially that was like precursors for deconstruction. That is, in one way, Freud deconstructs the notion of the subject, that it's not just this like blank, whatever existence of, the conscious subject, but it's the unconscious. However, but in one way, it itself would have this, Derridian critique of like, but then you kind of make this very concrete, science of psychoanalysis and, kind of continue recycling this. But this is still echo from psychoanalysis. I felt that, well, what really struck me is the last page. The last page, specifically this turn to the notion of a future as the monstrous. And that's where I would like, again, bring my Bataille that I've been reading a lot lately. And the notion of the monster in Bataille's work, specifically with regards to his writings in the journal Acephal, and I'll be brief about it, seems to be as an ideal kind of way of existence that we all have to like, this notion of Acephal, this headless kind of like beast or a monster that is specifically escaping the reason, is specifically escaping the logos that was posed to it as a kind of this, that he sees like this fascistic nature, this like kind of like repressive and, basically repressive nature. And that's where I weirdly think about Kojève and Hegel specifically.
You should.
Because for Kojève, that we've mentioned 2 sessions ago, we didn't talk about it, and it didn't seem that it was that important. But the notion of the end of history was specifically related to this the notion of a synthesis of a master and slave dialectic that ultimately should have ended in this figure of a citizen, like the third figure, who for him would be the citizen of a internationalist socialist state of the world that overcomes this, kind of relationship between master and slave that is very unjust, and constitutes a new society, wonderful society, socialist society. So again, and to come back to this fourth notion, and Anton can jump on that later and the comment, and I would love to hear him speak about it more, because we've read this paper I think a few weeks ago, again by Zizek, that like was very, despite the fact that we had many problems with Zizek. However, that paper, and June would not make me lie, it was very, very impressive, because this paper was called "Why all dialecticians should know how to count to four, if that's the title that I.
And we'll get Anton in the parallax.
Yes, yes, and the parallax, exactly. So this fourth notion, materialism, again, coming back to Bataille, for Bataille, very, very important notion that he introduced, base materialism. And base materialism, in one way or another, really seems something that Derrida kind of tries to do with this primordial, with this kind of before the word.
Arcade trace.
Exactly, exactly. And in one way or another, again, coming back to this like threefold of like master slave, citizen dialectic, to what extent would we say that this fourth notion is this specific monster's acceptance of the monstrous future and internalizing this role of a future subject, a revolutionary future subject,
Right,
but not this positivistic, logocentric,
sure.
future is, we are going all the way up, progress is science, all the, in this notion of a citizen, but in this fourth notion, there is this notion of a monster. Again, monster is, I don't want to like scare
Like a
everybody with
cartoon,
this. The monsters in the sense that like,
It's
they're
expressive.
talking about, exactly.
And the Bataille.
Bataille,
And
yeah.
by the way, they're coming back and we'll invite Anton in a second. But Bataille is a guy that is sitting there in the thirties taking the Kojève lectures.
Mhm.
With Lacan and everybody else. They're all there. The phenomenologists, the Heideggerians, what little Heidegger, early Levinas, they're all kind of like, whoa. The one thing we want to say, and then the time eternity historical line is also important in the Kojève lectures. But Bataille, he's a guy, Bataille, George Bataille. Is not a institutional academic. I think he's a librarian, he's an archivist, he's also a very complex history. Very important figure though. Post-structuralist. That makes sense because he has to jump over and then you see, oh, Foucault, Derrida. But the thesis about, without being a trained anthropologist, is that you think we're in a capitalist system, we're fighting over scarcity and resources, and that's how we compete. Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe that's how the economists talk about it. He goes, no, the problem of the West is that it doesn't know how to deal with excess. That's its problem. Maybe those non-Western indigenous spaces, the warrior cultures, have a distribution about honor, but it also decentralizes the ability to monopolize power and politically coerce it into oligarchic economic elites, which is what we're seeing now. The monster, the other monster, which is a real monster that you're seeing unfold. And long story short, we left that level of distribution and ability to ritualistically engage in our excesses. And to a certain extent, he's coming back to Nietzsche too, because we're trapped in this good evil structure and these simple systems of morality. But how come Western human beings can't handle the excess? Well, they did. They created this scary thing called the modern capitalist military industrial complex. So war capitalism now is the way you deal with the excess. And Bataille, as a revolutionary in his own way, is trying to figure out how do we attack that, which I think we're all trying to figure out together as a radical group, right? But coming back to the Anglo-American reception of what at least the Foucault and Deleuze for his part, we're not reading, maybe we should, the anti-fascist projects that he does with Guattari. Well, what's going on with these French guys in the 60s is that whether it's the Dasein of Heidegger, Hegel's culmination of spirit, freedom, and state and history, therefore Kojève and others, or any kind of Western Marxist trajectory about revolutionary praxis or the proletariat subjectivity. The problem by the time you get to the Derridas and maybe even the Foucaults is that there's no subject left. Even in the order of things, 1966, Foucault's talking about, hey, this modern social scientific Dilthey as the human and human as both subject and object of history. It's the scientific inquirer into the sciences of quote unquote man itself is a very temporary archaeological thing that can just blow away and something else is going to replace that. He's writing that in 66, publishing it earlier. But with at least those two, Deleuze will leave for a second. We don't have a human subject to begin or start with. And neither do I. I've said that from the very beginning. I don't believe Dasein has anything to do with the human being. And I this is maybe a good place for Anton others to come in. When you go into the depths of Derrida's works, it's an attempt, if we had the time, we'd scroll down to the passage where I wanted to isolate from chapter 1. All attempts at a post-Hegelian move. In a way, he's kind of, therefore, in response to Nietzsche and Heidegger, who are also post-Hegelians, Nietzsche's eternal return, Heidegger's ecstatic temporality, not the linear culmination of history, but something other that never dawned on it. It never appeared in Nietzsche, the full conception of it, which he says could have overturned all of our own values. Or for Heidegger, what is this? Who is time? If it's not this three, and the human subject is not in time itself, but is ecstatically stretched out over and beyond anything else in the world, but also clears everything else for everything else to appear? Is it some deeper structure of truth that maybe the pre-Socratics had access to, but we've leveled that out with our modern subjectivistic, nihilistic, technological flattening of everything, subjects and objects? That's the Heidegger, right? And here comes Derrida. If you don't have a human being, and yeah, the subject seems to be about speech and writing. Who's this we? Is it a generational thing? We were talking about generation. Right? I guess what I'm trying to get at is we cannot, after Derrida, going back to Hegel, and quite frankly, Marx, we're not going to be talking, and maybe this is where your work, Anton, and others are coming in, all of you, is we're not talking about a crass materialism. But we're talking about the space of immanence, to go back to a person like Bataille. That maybe even what the later Derrida was inquiring about is the space of the animal too. And don't forget those guys. I mean, we have to put them in, they become our slaves too in this hierarchy, the Eurocentric hierarchy. The Eurocentric hierarchy is, first of all, Western whiteness over everybody else, but then the human over the animal. And you tell the older generations, they don't want to hear that. But I talk to you, and we can have like a creative conversation. Okay, the animal is transcendent, which the later Derrida, as an old guy, was going to. Jeffrey, and then I want to create space also. So Jeffrey, please.
We were mentioning about the master was it great idea, and please correct me immediately if I'm going off track. But in response, like in kind of connection with Gustavo's question earlier, and the Hegel like thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And it's like thinking when you experience the present, that you're experiencing the synthesis of past thesis and antithesis. And then when you bring in something like Fukuyama declaring that something is the end of history, not only does it create closure and like this end of time, but it tries to disconnect that synthesis from the precluding theses and antitheses that created it. And so for a lot of people that view deconstruction as an oppositional or an antagonistic force to society, I think what happens is they're seeing a lot of they're seeing the synthesis not as the result of the thesis and antithesis, but as like a natural state. And they object to you trying to dig into the historical, like these two factors that come into it, because that creates the opportunity for the creation of the monster by changing the synthesis that is now into a thesis and contributing that antithesis into a completely, totally different future synthesis. And so I think that's what I don't think any of that, like anyone that actually considers it an oppositional force would ever consider it, like would ever explain it like that. But I think that's part of the reason that the idea of deconstruction and like going to the root of problems or like current modes of being or things like that, and finding those causal factors is so threatening to a subset of people that want to maintain status quo.
The point between 1989 and the Cold War, be interesting to bring in the context here. And then today, Jeffrey, how it's kind of come full circle, that the end of history didn't turn out to be Fukuyama's things, but this techno-oligarchic, monopolistic, fascistic, authoritarian, one-sided free speech, libertarian, heritage, nationalist, populist structure that's, cannibalizing our Western democracies as we speak with the right wing, hyper right wing. Musk is everywhere, right? But the quote was, "Oh, the problem with the West is its empathy. Empathy is weak, and it's for weaklings, and that's how we get exploited. And then all the immigrants and this and that, and all the trading partners, we all fail. We government workers, and we're just corrupt and just sucking away all your money. And we got to be strong." And then you can juxtapose that with the Nuremberg trials as one of the defining characteristics. Being on rent, but relation between lack of empathy and sociopathic thinking and evil. Point being is that the legitimate response, whether it's through deconstruction or otherwise, to the historical present is this mummification, if this is what occurred to us. Okay, that's my question for the group. And some of you may say, hey, I descend from Western Europe. But the West, in a way, has, if it's calcified itself into this extreme form of inhumanity, which we're seeing unfold, then the resistance, especially from a generational perspective, your generation, what's at stake is not just survival, or for example, anti-climate change, or the protection of pluralistic and diverse societies, or maybe a common basis for a renewed attempt to think about human rights on a universal level. I think for some of us, if we want to think about it, it's radical revolution. But what's helpful with Derrida, I believe, is the radical revolutionary nature, although he says earlier, it's not about being able to name writing or name any of this, or name what the faithful attentive is to perhaps a quasi-messianic kind of idea. But you don't want someone coming along proclaiming the end, because then we're universally all forced to accept it. There goes our freedom. Ironically, individual freedom. Musk and all these guys keep talking about individual freedom of speech. A lot of Vance is going to Europe saying, oh, you guys are weak in Europe. You guys are suppressing our ability to speak freely. But then they're going on censoring everything else. No, we're not talking about them. We're talking about the oppressed groups everywhere. Or as Bernie Sanders might say, I thought 99%, the 99% is more than 1%. 99% has to be. I want to put that before you. We only have a few minutes. I mean, let's strip away the philosophy here. I have a very simple question to ask anyone who's 18 to 22 or 24 or 27 or 30, whatever, but not me or anybody else. What's happening on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of severity, as far as you can tell, when you haven't been around that long? How bad is the situation? So that's not fair, because how can I compare it to previous epochs? Well, I've been around for a couple of epochs, though. Been around since at least the 80s. And what's your response? And you can say anything you want. Let's bring in Rosemary as an editor.
Rosemary, please.
Rosemary, back to Matvey, then Jeffrey.
Well, I like the sort of there's a quote from Adorno in an interview where the interviewer asks him, Dr. Adorno, until 2 weeks ago, the whole world seemed in order. And he says, not to me. And sort of in line with that, and also more even than Adorno in that sort of pithy quote, Benjamin's like whole concept or reading of history as basically being like the historical time, the linear dead time that we're in is basically like the only progress that exists is the progress of bodies getting higher and higher and higher, and the rubbish, the wreckage, the debris piling and piling up, but like the thing is, like, yes, now things are really bad, like I would say like a 10, but I would also argue that like imminent to the process itself, like, you know, like it's always been catastrophe, like since like the foundation at least of class society, like it's been nothing but defeat and catastrophe for, you know, all of like the world's oppressed people. And so like we can't really be like, oh well, things are so bad, or oh, things used to be so good and now they've gotten worse. Like, you know, yeah, things are like worse in the aggregate, but that's only because like we're further along in this process that imminently is just always like this like scaling. But of course, what Benjamin offers is that, you know, the messianic offer is that we can, in some fashion, you know, pull the emergency brake or break out of that continuum of linear time and enter messianic time and overcome history, abolish history, one might even say, and replace it with a whole different process. So that's, I mean, that's how I see things.
Okay, Matvey, Jeffrey, then Jude.
And
So,
for that specific reason, I guess, you know, that Rosemary identified that it's always been 10. Right now, it feels like it's 11 out
or
of 10.
10 plus.
10 plus, yeah, because it's, you know, it is specifically the time when, again, you know, continuing the emergency brake kind of metaphor, and also, you know, borrowing from, and Anton also has his hand up, and I bet like that's what he would also like to relate to. But it's precisely that metaphor of the light in the end of the tunnel. The 9 would mean that like, oh, still it's like there's some hope. 10, it's very bad, but like we can go all the way to 1. It's
beyond the closure.
So it's beyond, exactly, it's beyond the close, in the sense that like realizing that any light in the end of the tunnel that seems likely to be like enforcing any sort of positive energy is the light of the train that's coming in front of you, again, that is like headed so quickly from all the way of the tunnel. It is the train, and the only way is to embrace the fact that we are living today through the most catastrophic times, and fully embrace the fact that that's the end. It's not the end in the future. That's the end today, and only through this kind of, you know, full immersion into this end, there could be this kind of messianic, again, complete departure, and finding a revolutionary kind of forces that will resolve this end. So it's kind of like, so it's total despair that kind of jumps back into itself with the solution. Yeah, exactly. And this, I mean, yeah, that's,
I think I just want to gather perspectives to conclude. And then
Totally.
With Jeffrey, Jude, I think with Matvey and Rosemary start, maybe framing for our big 5-hour session, what comes after all these 3 figures and this question of the messianic. We'll think about that. So I think Gustavo wanted to come in. So Jeffrey, Jude, and then Gustavo. June?
June with an N.
June, okay, I heard Jude. Okay, yeah, June, when you said earlier, June with an N. Yeah, okay. So Jeffrey, June, and then Gustavo.
I want to take it just like a little bit of a different, because like I do fully agree with like
And Anton. And Anton.
like how it for most of the time it's been a 10 for like a lot, like the people living through it. But I think one thing that it feels different about now is both the centrality of the position of the United States and the Western world across mass media, and like the understanding of like the first world and like the developed, and the idea that we're seeing this strong support for this backsliding at a rate that I don't think has been seen outside of like extremely regressive governments like 30s Germany, 30s, 40s Germany.
Right.
But at that time, 30s, 40s Germany was very clearly by the people that mattered quote unquote, because God, there were a lot of people that were ignored in that definition, but were very clearly created as like framed as the antagonist and as someone who's like completely in the wrong. And it feels like the velocity of the backsliding combined with the fact that like we're trying to valorize it. And like society as a whole, and that feels like such a weird term to use, but is trying to glorify it as like we're going in the right direction. Makes it feel especially dire, I guess, to me.
When politics and capitalism completely collapse into each other and the psychopathology normalizes itself and commoditizes itself as a form of liberation, as the highest irony, but the greatest danger. I think that's what you're getting at. That points to the singularity, but I don't mean 10 as in like, yeah, of course, Cold War, everything post-World War II, Cold War as it's 10. Talk to millennials, they're in shock over 9/11, but I tend to singularize you all because, again, from 2017 to now, it's not like you had one or two hiccups. And that's a good percentage of your overall development, for which your trauma to come. Not to psychoanalyze you all, but you know, I was around for 9/11 and also end of 1989. It just, you know, most of us, we don't know anything before then. Just okay. We've got three perspectives here. June, and then Gustavo, and then Anton.
Yeah, so I was honestly struck by the very last page of Exergue, where Derrida is talking about the future appearing as a complete danger and as an absolute monstrosity. And it just very heavily reminded me of On the Concept of History by Walter Benjamin. And specifically, it invoked like his revolutionary messianism, as I see it. And specifically this bit he has at the very end in one of the appendixes, I believe Appendix B, where he talks about the possibility of the messianic rupture of history, as in every window of time, even the slightest second, is a possibility in which the Messiah might enter.
A portal.
Yeah, like a portal to redemption. And
Taking us back to this problem of the instant.
yeah, and with regards to the train analogy, which I really like because this is how this was first presented to me when I was reading John Zerzan on Benjamin. Do you know who that is?
No.
He's a green anarchist theorist. He thinks we should abolish writing, but anyway.
Somebody we should read.
He also thinks that like cave paintings were like should also be abolished because it was like the first form of representation. But anyway, like when the angel of history is looking at is facing the Antichrist and finds itself on this massive pile of rubble and bodies, it's looking in horror at the possibility of the Antichrist making its emergence. And once we reach that point, there really is no hope for redemption. But the revolutionary task is one of, and he says this in One Way Street, of cutting the fuse of the dynamite before it reaches the actual charge. And yeah, I think that that's a particularly good way to view this.
Okay, now we have four perspectives for the building blocks. Gustavo and Anton. And Paul's joining us as well. And then I need to conclude because I have to literally leave
Yes.
in 2 minutes.
Let's try to be brief, guys.
Yes.
Okay,
So
yeah.
Gustavo and then Anton briefly, and then I have to just conclude.
yeah, I'll be brief. Just going off of what Rosemary said on the idea of like times have always been hard. Now it kind of appears to be harder. And I think one of the reasons for that is just it feels like the preamble of a larger crumble. Like society is gonna crumble absolutely in every way possible. And we are like right there at the edge of the cliff to get down. At least that's what seems to me about Western imperialism, in the sense of it's not like the Western imperialism is going to crumble. It's like the Western imperialism is going to crumble everyone else. You're going to destroy everyone else, and then that's it. That's how it feels like today. But there's another perspective that I've heard. I don't know who said that, but I've heard from an indigenous activist saying that, you know, everyone feels like the apocalypse is really close, but for indigenous people, the apocalypse already happened countless times.
We're already assigned, as he said,
Exactly.
the Eurocentrism.
Exactly. It already
Genocidal
happened
violence.
for
That's
many,
right.
many, it already happened.
And it repeats.
Exactly. It already happened for the nations that still exist. But how about all of the other ones that are completely erased? Their language, their culture, their environment. So, you know, it puts into perspective, it's apocalypse now for whom? For middle class, for, you
Yep.
know, so
Who's excluded from this even apocalyptic messianic?
exactly.
It's alternative temporalization. Now
Yeah.
another piece. Let's go with Anton, and then I literally have 2 minutes. I have one point to make after Anton, very briefly, please, because then we'll have a much longer session with you, Anton. Please.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to actually to add to the last speaker, because my answer would be probably truly Zizhiken, in a way that I would actually introduce complex numbers into your scale, Professor Sampath, meaning that probably we should have a ±5 as a materialistic stability of this world, meaning that plus minus is, of course, some sort of asymmetry to matter as such, plus minus some imaginary addition to it, which would again be totally subjective how big it should be, but it should be, I would say, ±5 plus minus I out of 10. And by saying that, I also mean that it would probably be a truly Zizhiken fashion to say that living at the end of times means not just leaning towards the end of times, but being now constantly at the end of times. And so this is a sort of elaboration on the last words, like apocalypse now for whom? Depends on your imaginary phantasmatic addition to what makes matter matter. And yeah, it could be a billion I, or it could be just plus minus I. It's up to you. But there is always this apocalyptic living at the end of times included already now in the normality of things. So yeah, I would probably stop here for yeah.
Well, this is great. We have, and then please develop this further when we meet again. So the way I would conclude is that as a 20-year-old doctoral student with Derrida, spending the first few years just imbibing everything up until that point, what was available back in the early 90s. Heidegger, Nietzsche, Hegel, Kant, of course, the history of Western philosophy that sits on, going back to the pre-Socratics, Plato, Aristotle. I took it upon myself to actually try to conceptualize this danger and monstrosity, imbibing all of this. And I will say, whether it's Adorno's negative dialectics, and you know, you refer to Benjamin on Messianic time, and he doesn't mean that in any kind of religious way, obviously. When I meant four-dimensional, I meant that the response from me, which I'll try to introduce briefly, I don't see articulated. Whitehead actually had some ideas, but that's entirely different. Alfred Whitehead, the analytic tradition. But I don't mean origin and end, and I don't mean non-origin and non-end. I don't mean past, present, and future in any kind of configuration of that. I don't mean circular or linear time or rectilinear time, going back and forth, or Euclidean. I certainly don't want to talk about physics, because that's not metaphysics. Well, Einstein's and space-time, 3 dimensions of space, and attaching the 3 axes of time to that, and you get all kinds of funny things, reversibility and time dilation and Wormholes, etc. Black hole, blah, blah, blah. That's all physical, that's all ontic, that's all spatial, that's all the metaphysics of principle. So it's got to be something entirely other. as four-dimensional time. And that's what we have to open up. If it's not circular, linear, or rectangular, it doesn't have those polarities of origin and end, non-origin, non-end, what the other two there. But it has this kind of complex interrelationality at the heart of it. That would be the unarticulated, is what I tried to suggest in my thinking and works. To no one's reception, because it doesn't seem to answer any questions. Other than being something other than whatever they prophetically were announcing, it's something I will tell you is irreducible to the thought of Derrida, Hegel, and Heidegger, and therefore those that might have been influenced. I don't want to dismiss Zizek, and I'm not saying he's not a philosopher, and maybe who knows what he would say, but the chance to do speculative metaphysics again on the scale of what Hegel did leading up to his time has yet to be done. And the attempt to do so, I would say, back to people like the Derrida crowd and Heidegger, it's not Nietzsche's eternal return, whatever we think that is. It's not Heidegger's ecstatic temporality, which we briefly introduced. And it's not difference, which is delay and differing. So when I mean four-dimensional, do I mean a one-fold, four-fold, which you find also in the later Heidegger? No. So maybe I need to do away with these terms altogether at Anton, and I can't use numbers. But anyway, we're going to open up this space. You want to call it quasi-messianic or pseudo of the absolute other and the absolute in reaction to what we think is happening, and or otherwise, and plus, which is what's happening today. In other words, Western human beings finally may be being offered, if it's a gift or not, a whole other sense of time to come back to it's already occurred. It may not be a question of originating or ending with the West. It's just been buried. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.